Okay, Madam Chair, we are live.
All right, welcome everybody to the Thursday, January 16th afternoon meeting of the House Energy and Digital Infrastructure Committee. We are joined today by Jared Duval, Executive Director of the Energy Action Network. And we will just quickly go around the table and introduce ourselves, and then we will turn it over to you and let you identify yourself for the record. So I'm Representative Kathleen James of Bennington 4 District.
Scott Campbell of Calgary S from St. Johnsbury.
Richard Bailey, Lamoille 2.
Chris Morrow, Wyndham, Windsor, Bennington.
Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Dara Torrey, Washington 2.
Graham Klebner, Chittenden 13, Burlington.
I'm so sorry, Madam Chair.
Introduce yourself. Identify yourself.
Sibilia, Wyndham 2.
Great. All right. Over to you. If you could identify yourself for the record.
Well, good afternoon. For the record, my name is Jared Duval. Really glad to be with you. Thank you for the invitation, Chair James and members of the committee. I want to clarify up front, I'm joining you today and was invited in my capacity as Executive Director of the Energy Action Network. So I'll talk a little bit more about what EAN is in the slides I'll share shortly, but we're an independent nonprofit organization here based in Montpelier that does statewide data tracking, research, and analysis related to energy emissions, the economy, etc. And so I'm really glad to share with you today some of the summaries of that work, including from this annual progress report for Vermont that we produce each year. I do want to clarify up front, some of you may know me in an additional and different role, which is as an appointed member of the Vermont Climate Council, where I chair the Science and Data Subcommittee, serve on the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, and the Steering Committee of the Council. And the reason up front that I want to make the distinction is really important because Energy Action Network as a nonprofit organization does not take positions on bills before the legislature, on administrative proceedings. We don't do any lobbying. We are there to serve as a independent tracker and analyst and as a neutral convener of really diverse perspectives. We have members of our network who are on all different sides of public issues, and our job is to bring them together in a trusted way for conversations. That said, by being appointed to the Vermont Climate Council, I was given a legal responsibility and requirement to make policy recommendations to the legislature around what could meet the Global Warming Solutions Act commitments that the state has made. So in my council role, I often do have to talk about policy and policy recommendations, and I would be happy to do that at a future time in my council capacity. But my understanding is today I'm here, just the facts please, not as a counselor, just in my EAN role. So just wanted to share that up front. If it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and share screen for these slides. Those visible? Great. Okay.
I'm so excited that you have all those windows open, Jared.
Sorry, it's embarrassing. I should have closed those before. What I need to do is move this.
Wow.
And go. Oh, I can just click. Good. Okay. So, first to introduce Energy Action Network, and I do have a physical copy of which I'm happy to share at any point. Maybe I'll leave it to the end so we can focus on the slides first, but I do want to share these physical copies of the report after. Energy Action Network is really two things. It is a network of any organization, college, university, business, utility, any entity in the state of Vermont that wants to work together towards meeting the state's climate and energy commitments. And we host convenings for them. We have an annual summit, for instance. EAN also refers to a small nonprofit organization. We're based here in Montpelier. We have a staff of 3, and our primary role as a nonprofit is energy and emissions data tracking, research and analysis. And then we also serve as a kind of trusted neutral convener for a diverse network of members. In addition to our report, we're putting out research papers, research briefs all the time once there is new data and information available to help inform and ground the state's energy and climate conversation. So that's a little bit about EAN. And so Chair James had asked me to set some context about where does Vermont's energy come from? And then once we use it, where does it end up? I think both in terms of emissions was how you phrased it. Also, I want to look at where does our energy come from and where does it end up in terms of the dollars we spend on it and the questions of energy costs and savings and what that means for the larger affordability conversation. So this is a graph from our latest annual progress report that looks, these columns at the top show that we can look at how much energy is used, how much greenhouse gas emissions are produced, and how much we spend on energy by sector. And so when we look at that, and I'm going to go through those kind of in that order, where's our energy use come from, how much is it, and then look at the energy expenditures and emissions. But we see that across the board, whatever our lens of analysis is, most of our energy use, most of our greenhouse gas emissions, and most of our spending as a state goes for the energy that we use to get around for transportation and to heat our homes and buildings in the thermal sector. The electricity sector is also very important, especially when it comes to opportunities to save money and to reduce emissions by electrifying those transportation and thermal sectors that are right now incredibly fossil fuel dependent. But in terms of our current energy use, emissions, and expenditures, the electricity sector is less of the story than is our transportation and thermal sector. There's some interesting things that you can see in looking at these. These are scaled based on the percentages. So we actually use more energy in the thermal sector. That's another name for the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector. We actually use more energy for thermal activities. Most of it's heating, a little cooling, than we do for transportation. But more of our statewide emissions come from transportation than they do from the thermal sector. And that's primarily because our transportation sector is, of all of our energy sectors, is currently the most fossil fuel dependent. We have a lot more wood energy use for home and building heating in the thermal sector, which lowers, in terms of the way that the greenhouse gas inventory that the Agency of Natural Resources is produced, the way that emissions are measured, it leads to lower emissions in the thermal sector, even though there's higher energy use and higher emissions in the transportation sector.
I have a question. I have a couple questions. So I sometimes need to take things back to like really basic.
Yeah.
So so the transportation sector, obviously that's all of our cars and buses and things that we're driving around, mostly fueled by gasoline. Where do EVs fall under the electricity sector?
So when we're counting energy use,
Yeah.
we count EVs in transportation.
Okay.
But the emissions from that electricity in the official greenhouse gas inventory would be in the electricity sector.
Okay. So we've got how we get around, how we heat our homes, and all the things we plug in.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's it.
And so to dig a little deeper, this is another way of looking at our energy use. So these top pie charts are scaled by the amount of energy that the state uses. So largest is the thermal sector. You can see that nearly 3/4 of that energy use is fossil fuel, about 26% fuel oil and kerosene, 26% fossil gas, also sometimes called utility gas or natural gas, 20% propane, and then the biggest chunk that is not fossil fuels comes from wood heating, primarily cordwood, wood chips, and wood pellets. There's a small amount that's electricity. That's a combination of some old more inefficient electric resistance, like electric baseboard or
Baseboards,
space resistant space heaters, but also the increasing number of cold climate heat pumps for space heating and heat pump water heaters. And then also a small amount of liquid biofuels that would be like biodiesel blended with fuel oil or renewable natural gas blended in with the gas deliveries in the gas system.
Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Howland.
So the renewable natural gas, when you're saying is mixed, you mentioned a couple of those mixed in the biofuels. Does that only represent that portion that is not natural gas and the base fuels to make the mix, and the other portion of that, say it's a, for simplicity, a 90-10 split.
Yeah.
So that would represent 10% and the other 90% would be up in the brown fossil fuel?
That's right. So this percentage is the percentage of the total, not the percent of RNG in the gas system. So yes.
I don't know if I heard the answer the same as I asked it. So in the 94, so this represents the 10% of the renewable that's mixed with 90% fossil, and each go into its respective spot.
So renewable natural gas is a little bit different because that's in the gas pipeline system. And so tell me if I'm hearing you wrong, but what I think I heard is that RNG is a larger proportion of the gas system than 0.5%. I don't know exactly what it is off the top of my head. I have to look.
You know, if I may, Madam Chair.
Yes, sorry,
Uh,
Representative Howland.
So I think what my colleague is asking is that 0.5% RNG, is that 100% RNG, or is that the mix of RNG with natural gas?
Oh, that's 100% RNG, but it does get mixed with
Yes,
fossil,
right.
the
Okay.
fossil gas here.
And the fossil.
Sorry.
All right, okay.
And so
Representative Morrow, sorry.
This 2023 data?
this is 2022.
I see. I didn't even see that. Okay.
We're always trying to get the most recent data. Sometimes there are delays.
Right, okay. Yeah.
So if we move to the right, the transportation sector, as you said, Chair James, most of that energy is gasoline. 2/3 is gasoline, about a quarter is diesel. More diesel is used in medium and heavy duty vehicles. Gasoline is primarily used in the light duty fleet. And the small amount of what is renewable in there, and renewable doesn't necessarily mean low emitting, but renewable, is ethanol that's blended with gasoline, biodiesel that's blended with diesel, and a very small amount, 0.2% right now, that is electricity used for electric vehicles. So just to put this in context, I've got numbers later, but I don't have the exact number for you. This is a rough estimate. Vermont's total vehicle fleet, about 550,000 vehicles, just under the total population of the state. As of July last year, we had 15,000 electric vehicles. The 15,000 out of 550,000 plus, and electric vehicles are, 4 times as efficient as gas vehicles at transferring energy into movement. And so it's a very small amount of electricity that gets used for that right now.
3% of the fleet, but 0.2% of the energy use, roughly.
As of 2022, and also that percent of the fleet there's a bit of a disconnect there because I just gave you a 2024 number and this is 2022 energy use. I think it's likely that small electricity wedge has gone up in the past couple of years a little bit. And then the last one is the electricity sector. This is showing our electricity use broken down by source post-REC accounting, post-renewable energy certificate or renewable energy credit accounting in line with Vermont law and the ISO New England system. And so I do have another graph that can show how it breaks down based on initial purchases before renewable energy certificates are bought and sold. But this is the way that's legally consistent. And it shows that right now, our electricity is 75% renewable, 16% nuclear, and less than 10%, 9% fossil fuel based. And that share is the electricity that we purchase from the residual system mix for ISO New England. And so it is by far our lowest energy use sector, and it's our most renewable at this point. Any questions? Is that a helpful? I like the scaled pie charts to be able to see total energy use and then how it breaks down in those wedges in terms of the source.
Yep.
May I? Madam Chair?
Yep. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry, I was very absorbed in the pie charts. Yes.
I was
Representative Campbell.
just gonna ask you, Chair, you're going to explain the renewable energy credits versus actual energy generation and all of that, or the actual energy usage at some point.
Yes, happy to at least
Touch on it.
touch on. Yeah, it can be a very long conversation. So this is a pick your favorite breakfast sphere with a hole in the middle. Donut chart, bagel chart, that shows our electricity portfolio post rec accounting. And you can see that more than half is electricity from Hydro-Quebec, other regional hydro shown here. This darker green, the bolder green color, the solar and hydro, that 10% combined of the 3 plus the 7, those are in-state resources. The more muted colors are all out-of-state resources. It's interesting if you compare, this is pre-rec accounting, and you see that there's much more renewable energy produced in-state than we actually end up accounting for at the end of the kind of the rec accounting process, because those are high value recs to other states. So they get sold to those other states. So a lot of the in-state generation doesn't get counted in Vermont because other states are paying for it. So this is pre-rec accounting. That's post-rec accounting. So you go from about, 27, 33, maybe 34% of our energy being produced, our electricity being produced in state that we're counting in our electricity portfolio, to this lower amount post-rec accounting. But either way, I think one of the important things to point out is that this share that's fossil, which is where most of the pollution, the climate pollution comes from, is 9% post-rec accounting, and it's 7% for either way. We're less than 10% fossil fuel dependent. And really the appropriate way to look at it is in terms of the way the law is written and the way electricity markets work, which is post-rec accounting. So that's the breakdown. I should say that over time, this is going to shift because of, in large part, the law that the legislature passed last year that updates the renewable energy standard, which puts us on a path to requiring a 100% renewable electricity portfolio by 2035. So over time, we're going to see these shrink and these grow.
And so this shows where we get or how we're generating our energy. This little table, right?
Yeah, I would. It's complicated in terms of the phrasing. I think the most accurate way to say it is this is represents a purchased electricity portfolio or purchased electricity resources that we have legal claim to based on rec sales, which is a little bit different than generation because there's electricity generation that happens in the state, but it's then being connected to the ISO New England system. So who's taking credit or accounting for that electricity could be another state that we sell that electricity to.
Rep Southworth and then Rep Howland.
So based on that chart, Vermont is already over 70% clean energy purchase. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So the renewable energy credit could be sold to out of state where the energy itself is used in state. It's sort of like you are charging the battery to give the ability to support the grid,
Yeah.
if you will. So you have put electricity into the grid to support the frequencies and the like, but the energy actually gets used closest, it gets manufactured and used as close generation to consumption, but the credit for that goes to out of state. So the difference between your pre-rec and your post-rec.
I think there's an important distinction in what you said, which is that yes, there is more renewable energy generated in Vermont than is shown here, but I don't think it would make sense for us to say that that's used in Vermont, because once the electricity is generated, it goes into our grid, and electricity is moving at near the speed of light, right? I have to brush up on my physics,
Right.
But it's moving so fast that being able to account for where it's actually used is really difficult. It could be Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut. And so I think that's a big part of why RECs were created, because it's not like a barrel of oil where you know where it's going and being used. Once those electrons and ions are on the system, they're everywhere on the system. And so in order to account for the use, that's one of the reasons that the REC system was created. But I agree with what you're saying in terms of generation. I just wouldn't extend that to, therefore, electricity use. If that's helpful. Sorry, it's complicated. The electricity system in particular.
It is, and we haven't yet, taken testimony on even isoning under the grid.
Yeah.
So, Representative Southworth?
So does any of your research have any bearing on what percentage of power is generated on off-grid solar, off-grid wind, for people where it's not put back into the grid, it is just for their own generation purposes?
That is a great question. I would have to go back and look at these numbers to see if that is accounted for in here. I don't immediately recall that it is, because I think that what this is really, my recollection is that this is data looking at our electric utilities purchase portfolios. And so if it's off grid, it wouldn't be showing up in those numbers.
Okay, I would like to see that, because I think that might have a bearing on quite a few different things. I mean, if you have 10 people that are not showing in your graphs as purchasing, they're doing their own, that should have some bearing in that somewhere.
Just a question on why nuclear is not considered green, being it has the lowest carbon footprint.
Yeah. So the color scheme here, green is really meant to track with renewable. So agreed that in most accounting systems, nuclear is either counted as zero or low carbon, which is why we don't have it in the orange, which represents fossil. It's kind of in its own category. It is lower emitting, but it is not renewable. It's not a renewable electricity resource. So, but I totally hear the feedback that the color scheme of green versus when we say green, what does it mean? That there can be a difference there.
Thank you.
Good to proceed. Okay. So I also want to look at where the dollar flows go. And I want to focus on not the percentages at first, but the amount of dollars. So this is data from latest data we could get from 2023. And if you combine all of our fossil fuel spending at least in the transportation and thermal sector, so all the gasoline, diesel, fuel oil, propane, fossil gas, kerosene, etc., you'll see that those amounts here and here, they add up to over $2.2 billion. So Vermonters collectively spent over $2.2 billion on fossil fuel energy in 2022, and we spent collectively a little less than $1 billion on electricity. That's one part of what these infographics show. The other part is how much of that money stays in state or leaves the state. So fossil fuels are 100% imported into Vermont. We don't produce or refine any here. So, and most of the cost of that fuel is the wholesale commodity price that's charged by the company that exports it to Vermont. And so most of that money is going back to that out-of-state company to pay for the out-of-state fuel. Now, some of that money does recirculate. It will go to local fuel dealers, their truck drivers, things like that. The story is different when it comes to the electricity sector. We're actually, I wish I had found a way to update this slide so it stays with it in terms of the submitted resources, but at least in this testimony and on the video stream, I want to make this correction. We actually just met with the Public Service Department to take account of transmission costs, and that changes this number a little bit. So we think it's now more like 60% of the money that we spend on electricity as a state stays and recirculates in the state. Because you think about when you pay an electric bill, what's that money going towards? A very large share of it, much larger share than is related to the fossil, is going to labor. That's line maintenance, it's tree trimming, it's customer service operations, it's going to the distribution system. All of those things are in state. The transmission system, a little bit of it's in state, but most of it's the ISO New England system. So we're correcting this to account for that. And it's probably more like 60-40. But it's still a big difference in terms of how much our energy dollars stay and recirculate local and contribute to the Vermont economy versus how much they're going to out-of-state companies. This is another really important thing in the comparison of the different energy sectors and energy sources, and it's the difference in efficiency. So in a gas vehicle, let's start with the right-hand one. Less than a quarter, and this is from the fueleconomy.gov from the federal government, less than a quarter of the energy that's put in, gasoline, ends up actually moving the vehicle. More than 3/4 of the energy that's used as gasoline gets lost in the form of heat and other engine losses. In contrast with an electric vehicle, which has, electric motors are much more efficient than internal combustion engines, you end up seeing 87 to 91% of the electricity that's put in the vehicle actually moving the vehicle. And so what that means is the amount of energy that goes into moving a gas car 100 miles, that same amount of energy represented as electricity, moves an electric vehicle 350 to 550 miles, for instance. We also see this difference and so when we talk about, is it possible to reduce energy use, reduce emissions, and reduce costs? This key difference in the efficiency of the energy technologies, combustion versus modern electric technology, is really at the root of this conversation. So I want to just kind of establish it up front. We see the same thing on the thermal side. In terms of how efficient a combustion system can be at generating heat, it's maxed out by the laws of thermodynamics. You can't get above 100% efficiency because you're burning something to generate heat. See Vice Chair Kimball nodding. He knows this very well from his previous career. But heat pump technology, whether it's in a heat pump water heater, cold climate heat pump, air source ground, whatever, that is using that is used to transfer heat from one source to another rather than to generate it. And so you can get these efficiency rates that are 3 or 4 times higher, allowing you to use far less energy to accomplish the same task or the same result, whether it's moving somewhere or whether it's heating space or water. Yes, Representative Torrey.
Thank you.
That's fine.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. No, I'm getting very absorbed
Me
here. So
too,
yes,
me too.
Representative Torrey.
So as we electrify in Vermont, assuming we don't end up with data centers, where our overall energy usage is going down.
Yes, if you're adding electricity use with fossil use, the electricity use is going up, but the total energy use is going down because we're getting the benefits of that more efficient use of energy. Yes. And so that's such a great and important point. So if we go back here, what we would see over time is that the size of these pies would be shrinking. even as the electricity wedge here and here is growing, the size of the pie would be going down because we're using less energy, because we're using energy more efficiently. And it's not, oftentimes we talk about energy efficiency as though we mean like more efficient light bulbs or weatherizing a building. But there's also these really important efficiency differences and benefits of modern electric technology versus combustion technology.
And I would also add that the investments being made now in electric technology are higher than in improving efficiency in automobiles and so forth, just because of the way the global market's going. And I know heat pump technology, this is data from what year? This slide?
I mean, I believe this is 2023. I would have to go back and be sure.
So 2023. So I put in heat pumps in early 2020 and they were like 210% efficient. By 2023, they were 240. Now they're like 300 or something. So they're becoming efficient at a really rapid rate. And there's a theoretical limit that's like 2,000% or something crazy. So there's room for them to get better over time, whereas the emissions from fossil fuels are kind of staying the same over time.
Yeah, and these, I should note that these efficiencies are average efficiencies, and how efficient either a gas vehicle or an electric vehicle or a heat pump is will depend on if it's on the outdoor temperature. And as temperatures go down, electric vehicles become less efficient and air source heat pumps become less efficient. But this is an average efficiency that accounts for that. So there's times when it's more efficient than what you're seeing on this average here. I also want to look at, so we were talking about where does the energy come from, and then what is the nature of it in terms of the economics of it that Vermonters face and that we see in the Vermont economy. So this tracks gasoline, diesel, and electricity prices since 2005. And what we see is that gasoline and diesel are generally higher cost and much more price volatile. You get this kind of like roller coaster like curve in terms of their costs. You know, just to like put in perspective this volatility, I think the average price of gasoline this week in Vermont is about $3.09 a gallon. In June of 2022, it was over $5 a gallon. So we can see these really big swings that you see in these peaks and valleys. But it has consistently been higher than the equivalent cost from a fuel perspective of charging an EV. So this green line here is the statewide average cost of charging an EV in Vermont. But there are lower cost charging options available if your utility offers an EV rate. So Green Mountain Power says if you sign up for our EV rate, it'll cost you the equivalent of $1.20 a gallon. So there is an opportunity to move away from higher cost, more price volatile cost curves to lower cost, more price stable energy costs in the transportation sector. Of course, this is just the fuel costs. There's also the equipment costs. And one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest tension points in the energy transition, right, is that for a lot of the people who are able to make the transition to this much more efficient and lower cost technology, there's an upfront investment cost. And so, yes, over the lifetime, a lot of the modeling, a lot of the analysis shows you will save money. But how do you get over that initial hurdle? And there's a question of what is the role of public policy in terms of helping people who cannot get over that hurdle access these technologies that can cut costs and cut pollution at the same time. This is the same data on the heating side, comparing different heating fuel options. You'll see the same general shape in the purple is fuel oil, pink is kerosene, gray is propane, you know, a lot of price volatility. The lower cost, more price stable options, it's not uniform on the fossil fuel side. There's a lot of high cost and price volatility for fuel oil, propane, kerosene. Fossil gas utility gas, natural gas, whatever you want to call it, is, more stable and lower cost in comparison. And then, wood heating through wood pellets or wood chips, also lower cost and more price stable from a fuel perspective. I want to point out the really important difference between electric heat pumps, that line, and electric resistance. You see that they have the same price, 22 cents kilowatt hour, but this y-axis is showing on a common energy unit the amount of delivered heat per dollar. And because electric heat pumps are so much more efficient, like 3 times more efficient than electric resistance, that's why their costs are about 3 times lower. It goes back to that what does the energy actually accomplish and how efficient is it in doing that? So there is an important distinction. When we talk about the cost saving opportunities of electricity, it's not, older, inefficient electric resistance heating systems. We're talking about the modern, more energy efficient cold climate heat pumps and heat pump water heaters.
Yeah.
Can we back up one slide? The electric line, the green, the electricity, because those rates are regulated, isn't that sort of artificial peaks and that if it was actually out on the free market, it would be could be a lot peaks and valleys on it?
Potentially, I think that it's a combination of the regulated rates that utilities propose, Public Utility Commission approves, but I think it also reflects the cost of the power purchases and what they're finding on the market and what contracts they're purchasing. And I think because Vermont is a state that has many long-term contracts, we see that greater price stability than you would see in the electricity price line in other states.
Civilian.
Yeah, I recognize the question was for the witness, but having had a little experience in this policy area, yes. And this is why we have seen tremendous volatility in our neighbors who don't have a regulated structure for electric in terms of their prices. And Vermont's either the lowest or second lowest in New England because of that regulatory scheme. But I think you put your finger right on. It's because of that regulation you don't see the volatility.
And I was also going to mention the long-term contracts, which we don't get for gasoline, but which we do get. Like, how long is our contract with Hydro-Quebec right now?
Oh gosh.
Anyhow, it's a bunch of years.
Yeah.
At a stabilized
Right,
rate.
I understand. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have a question back to the RECs conversation. The sale of those RECs, the money goes to the utilities, right? And so that helps them reduce the rates. So as we become more renewable in the state, we as consumers of electricity benefit from that price stabilization. Is that true?
That's my understanding. I mean, I do think that utility witnesses or witnesses from the Public Service Department would be able to speak with more specificity than I would. But my understanding is that, yes, when electric utilities sell in-state the renewable attributes of that revenue comes back to them and allows them to lower rates for customers.
Go ahead.
So the fuel prices include the road use taxes in those prices. And then the electric rate, the GMP equivalent of $1.2 per gallon, that is charged at home at I'll call it the residential rate for the time being. But it doesn't include the new increased registration charges or other charges that are coming down the pipeline for EV vehicles.
Right. I think that rate would reflect some, not just the cost of electricity, but some other fees. But in terms of that EV registration amount, that would not show up in here. Neither would the registration cost of a gas or diesel vehicle.
Just because that's not how the
This is about
Data
the
works?
fuel,
Yeah, this is about the fuel. Okay,
not the vehicle registration.
okay.
No, but when you refer to the EV rate, is that a proposal by the utilities for a controlled EV plug-in? If you may remember the word off-peak electric hot water heaters, and they gave you that, didn't give you, they sold it to you at a lower rate, but they controlled the hours that you used it. Is that the case here? So it's not the equivalent of the rate one?
Exactly. You're exactly right. So this green line that says 171 would just be the regular residential rate. These dots below show the lower rate if you give them access to your charger so that charging can be avoided during those peak electricity events where electricity is the most expensive, which helps everybody save money, avoiding those peak events.
And if I might add my personal experience as an electric car driver in Burlington, and having just registered my car for another 2 years and paid the largest registration fee of my life. So two things. Your point is very well taken. That doesn't include the registration. You know, it's like $200 a year or something. And if you drive 10,000 miles, it's like 2 cents a gallon. But I will also add, Burlington Electric's tough with that electric vehicle charging rate. Because you get that if you charge between 10 p.m. and noon, but if you miss like 5 minutes in a month, the whole month goes to the higher rate. Like you got to be clean the whole month to get that rate, and it's tough. Like, and you can program your charging station in your car to only charge those hours, and then someone else in your household screws it up.
Someone to be unnamed.
But, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Getting back to Chris's question about the fuel, the tax is still included in that price for the fuel that when you're doing that analysis, which makes it higher.
Yeah, I would have to go back to be 100% sure, but my belief is that this reflects the price that people are paying on their electricity bill or at the pump. Which would include taxes and fees on both of them. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
So here, we've talked about energy costs. Those energy costs fall differently, depending on where you live and how much money you make. One of the really problematic differences is that let's start with this one on the left. Folks with lower incomes, you see here on the bottom x-axis, grouped by income. Folks with lower incomes are on average buying and spending, using less energy than folks with upper incomes. Often you don't have the bigger houses, maybe you're not traveling as much. However, the money that lower income, and so you see this like increasing bars, the more income people make, the more energy they're using and buying. However, the lower amount of energy that lower income Vermonters are using takes up a far higher share of their budget. So folks who are below 60% of area median income, they're spending almost $1,000 less than folks who make over 120% of area median income and energy. But it's taking up 19% of their household budget versus 3% of the household budget of the upper income folks. So this is just really important to understand because it's a key difference, right? Lower income folks are on average using less energy and spending less on energy, but it's a much higher energy cost burden in terms of the overall household budget for lower and middle income people than it is for upper income folks. And we see the same thing on the transportation side, although the variation in terms of how much people drive and therefore how much, when they're using a gas car, how much gasoline they use and what they pay for it, there's wide variation. And there's, somebody who's a high gasoline user and, makes $25,000 to $50,000, 20% of their budget household budget will get eaten up by those gasoline costs, as compared to a typical or an average gasoline user where that burden may be lower.
So folks with a household income of 25,000 or less are spending between 11 and 43%. I'm reading this right? They're spending up between 11 and 43% of their household income on gas, depending on whether they're typical or high.
Some are lower than that. That typical is an average. So some are lower. The high gasoline users are, I believe it's the top 14% of gasoline users in Vermont.
Are spending 43% of their household income on gas.
Average.
So folks who are commuting to work is what I'm assuming. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the more rural areas too.
And the
because
more
they have
rural
to travel
areas.
Further to
Yeah.
get to their
To get everywhere.
appointment.
And to groceries and.
All of it.
Yeah.
So like, for instance, the average Vermonter is, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's, I believe, somewhere between 11 and 12,000 vehicle miles traveled per year. But you see some folks who, depending on their job or their commute or whatever, maybe 40,000 miles a year. So that's where these big differences in expense can come from in terms of, especially on gasoline.
Is that a hand or a?
No, all right, I'll ask the question.
I'm watching.
No. So the amount of gasoline that's used by a person who uses his vehicle, it's a person's income based on the amount of gasoline that person buys over the year, whether he is employed as, say, a carpenter or a trash hauler, maybe somebody who's going to move all the time in his little private neighborhood business, that he's using a higher amount of his household income. I just don't see where the business dollars or I understand that somebody lives in Derby Line, not to pick on them, that may come, the Northeast Kingdom, where they travel a long way for everything from groceries to even filling up the gas itself today, versus somebody who lives in a district like on rural Rutland Park, downtown Rutland, who has a very short commute, stops by the grocery store on the way home and reduces. You use the term, you still have the average of 12,000 miles per driver, and I don't have any idea what that 12,000 relates to the Northeast Kingdom driver and the Rutland City driver or Burlington driver.
I think it's such a great point, because it's not just a function of income, of course, although we can break it down by that and look at it. It's also geography.
But when I talk to people about how they get compensated for their vehicle usage, they get a stipend like we do, but part than that dollars that I buy to gas to come back and forth to here, or electric, whatever I charge it, is in that out of my other pocket. I got another wallet here that I'm not taking the dollars out because coming. But that's a small amount of people who work in that type of business, but globally, it probably is insignificant.
I didn't see the order of hands.
Okay,
Scott, and then Representative Campbell.
Thank you. So that brings up an interesting point. Are these costs kind of filtered out for residential usage versus business usage somehow? Or do you have any sense of that?
The one on the left is going to be by household, and it's reported in the American Community Survey. So we're asking households, so it wouldn't include businesses. The one on the right is from a data organization in Massachusetts called Cultura, but they have a gasoline data center that has information from all states. And I would have to double check to be 100% sure, but I believe that this is personal driving versus business driving.
Yeah, certainly one of the complications would be that there are probably a fairly, well, perhaps a higher percentage of people, sort of sole proprietors who
Yeah.
drive their own vehicles
Yeah,
for,
some it's not.
you know, stuff like that, which are just be impossible to sort out. It seems
Totally, you couldn't.
Yeah.
My dad was a handyman, independent contractor, and what was
Right.
the difference between?
Right. Okay, just wondering about that. Oh, I think Richard.
Yes.
So I have a question, regarding when we carpool. So my car gets 20 miles a gallon. I'm 20, then I put 3 other passengers in, so that's 80 miles of the gallon. Because those 3 people are not driving, so I take that credit, saying I've saved 80 miles. My 20, you don't count my 20, but I count the
There's
80, they're 60. So is that considered as a factor when you were saying individual drivers, but maybe they're hauling kids to school, there might be 4 people in that car, or,
Yeah, that's not.
is there any kind
accounted
of adjustment for that?
Here, this is just that vehicle and its costs, and versus the income of that driver.
So it's a one-on-one?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the American Community Survey is literally a survey that goes to households. So I don't know what this question is, if it asks, what is your literal heating but
Yes, on that side. On the other one, it's tracking individual vehicles and their mileage. So these are 2 different data sources. The one on the right about transportation and gasoline is Cultura. The one on the left is the American Community Survey as it relates to heating and electric costs. We didn't have the best data source we could get on the transportation side was this Cultura.
And just one other comment that I don't know what the percentage is, but the percentage of single occupancy vehicle commuting is really high, 70, 80 or something like that, maybe even more. So, and there have been studies about that in some ways. That's another issue for us, right?
Right, not a lot of carpooling. Okay, next slide.
So we've gone over energy use.
Yes.
Where it comes from, we've talked about energy expenditures and costs through looking at different ways. And then I was also asked to cover emissions. So this graph on the left in the kind of bolder colors shows Vermont's historical emissions as inventoried and reported by the Agency of Natural Resources in their annual greenhouse gas inventory for the state. This reflects the very latest greenhouse gas emissions inventory that went through 2021. And we had 8.28 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And the colors here show the emissions from the different sectors. So most emissions from transportation, then thermal, and then you can see the other sectors in other colors. On the right, those blue dots show the targets that were set in the Global Warming Solutions Act for emissions reduction over time to be in line with national commitments and international agreements in terms of what are the science-based targets of reducing emissions to avoid the worst impacts of a destabilized climate. And so that reflects Vermont doing our part to reduce emissions in line with science-based targets and national commitments. So that would, that is shown by those blue dots. And if we were to reduce emissions proportionally across the sectors relative to what they emit now, that's what the size of them would be over time. It's likely not going to happen that way. Different sectors have different opportunities to reduce emissions more or less cost effectively. But just as like a visual illustration, where we've come from on emissions and where the state has committed to go.
Yeah, Representative.
And I think we should point out that although it's not gonna happen that way because the world is messy, the Global Warming Solutions Act does require the reductions to be proportionate to the current contributions by sector.
So the language, it doesn't actually require it. It asks for a plan to be put together that would account for achieving proportional, but there's not a firm requirement around it.
Thank you.
The only requirement is meeting the statewide emissions reduction. And I'm sorry, I don't have that language in front of me, but I can pull it up and share it if that's
I
helpful.
believe you.
Yeah, Rep. Sibilia.
Jared, would you mind going back one slide? And I'm gonna go over some well-trod ground between you and I, in terms of emissions reductions versus, kind of economic impact and what we're seeing happening with the economy. So this is projecting, it's projecting our requirements and where the emissions reduction would have to happen. Something that I'm trying to get more data, depicted on and understand who is thinking about this and accounting for this is really the transition in the economy that is happening naturally. Sans us doing anything, because the energy transition is happening. No one has forced Representative Kleppner to buy an EV. He's doing it, as are a number of other folks, and that's changing the economy. Are you in any way tracking that economic transition, and or if you're not, do you know where we could best see that happening?
Answer, and then I have a question.
Yes.
So one of the things, and so I'm just going to take off my EAN hat for a minute and put on my Climate Council hat for a minute.
Okay.
One of the things that has been supporting the Climate Council in its work is modeling that the Agency of Natural Resources has commissioned around a pathways analysis, including a baseline or a business as usual model around how much emissions reduction are we going to get just as a estimated result of things that are already underway, policies, programs, market transformation that's already happening. Because we know that on that trajectory, it's likely that we're going to get emissions reduction that happens as a matter of course.
Right.
And so then the question becomes, what is the difference between where that would lead versus what additional emissions reduction would need to be required through new or additional policy or programs? And so that's being updated right now, is this business as usual model and the pathways model. Right now, all the modeling that's been done suggests that we will see some emissions reduction on a business as usual trajectory, but not nearly the amount of reduction that would be necessary to meet the obligations without additional policy and regulatory actions.
So I would just like to come back to, so then the difference is, what is necessary for emissions reduction? That is your focus is on emissions reductions. Some people like myself are worried about Vermonters being left behind and seeing an increase in burden because they are in fossil fuel prices, a lack of access, a lack of choice as that's transitioning. And so those two things are not exactly the same, the economic impact and the emissions, they're connected. But, I just want to make sure, so you're saying pathways report, and I have to think about that, but I think it's really important, Madam Chair, for us to also understand what is happening to our economy, both naturally and as a part of regulation, So, and I myself am trying to get better about talking about that, so I don't know that I can be more articulate in this moment.
Too bad, because, because this is how because you and I have talked about this, this is also the lens that I view our climate work through.
Yeah.
So emissions reductions to me are the metric, but the real story is how we're helping Vermonters heat their homes and get around. And you've mentioned this a couple times now, and I realize I can't picture in my mind when you say who's tracking the economy, who's tracking the economic transition, who's doing that work, where do we get that data? I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what kind of stats you're talking about. I don't know what kind of report you're talking about. I can't picture,
I have a
I
very.
think it's really important,
Yeah.
and I don't know what you're talking about
So-
simultaneously.
I have a specific example, and it's work that Representative Campbell, I think you were on the committee, and I have done on telecommunications, which is, that became an urgent issue because we could see that the economy is changing. So we had an unregulated broadband and cell, expanding where it was competitive and where they could make market. And then we had a regulated, which was copper landline, that had competition from those unregulated. But they were required to hold the lines up in places where I live, and you live in the Southern Kingdom, which is also very rural. That's not getting away from my NUK friends. But we could see that there was an economic change that was happening there, and the most vulnerable folks, like rural folks and poor folks, were not able to participate in that competition, and we're seeing something deteriorate and become more and more expensive and less reliable. So that is, like, how could we have seen that coming is what I am worried about now with this.
And I share that concern and have been thinking for some time, specifically on the Vermonters left behind, as you said, and in terms of heat pumps, and I've asked a few times, how many homes heating with oil does a truck have to be delivering to for that truck to be economically viable?
Yeah.
And thinking about, as one by one, some of those houses convert, and instead of getting oil every fall, they only need it every 5 years or whatever, right? At some point, the person driving that truck, and these are often one person who owns one truck or one person who owns two trucks, and the person and their kid drives them and whatever. At some point, it becomes not worth their while, and they sell, and some other distribution company buys their truck and some of their customers. But there are going to be some of those customers maybe who the new company isn't willing to deliver to, and then we have an emergency. We have someone who says, I heat with oil and no one will deliver oil to my home. Help. And I think it's something that my former colleagues on the Climate Council would do well to have a plan for, and that we also would do well to have a plan for.
I think that's a great point, and I can think of an exact analogy, which is in the dairy industry, as the dairy. The trucks that pick up milk got larger. They stopped stopping at the smaller farms, and the smaller farms, became unviable for them to stay in business. So it very well might happen that the oil delivery, so retail service will migrate to larger trucks in order to get economies of scale as the business gets squeezed. This very well could happen.
And I am aware with the work that I do outside of here is on economic work with the workforce challenges and just talking to the industry that there is already, we are seeing consolidation in the heating fuel sector.
So
Okay, I'm
this
sorry,
We're off.
Jared,
We're off.
I'm sorry,
Lots of thoughts.
we have, let's,
Sorry.
sorry about that. No, I did it. So,
this is
Mr. Duval, we would like to honor your time and your presentation, but this is a good talk.
Well, it's a fruitful area for exploration for EAN in the future to look at the economic transformation, or the transformation of the economy as also sort of a looming threat, I guess.
And I do have some slides and data that I think will speak partially to this, not fully, but I would really welcome feedback on requested data, requested analysis in terms of, we're always trying to change and improve what we're illustrating and how. So we really welcome that feedback. I will just say before I take my council hat off and put my EAN hat back on, that I think that this is the biggest concern of this transition. Is right now we have a high cost, high polluting energy system that's very inefficient, uses a lot of fossil fuel. Vermonters are paying a lot of money for it. $2.2 billion a year in fossil fuel. You look at average heating and electricity costs for the average household in Vermont, $3,000 to $4,000 a year. Average costs for a gas vehicle, $1,000 to $2,000 a year. Average household has 2 vehicles. You're talking $5,000 to $8,000 just in fuel costs for heating and transportation. And the situation we have right now is that the folks who are able to afford the more efficient, over time, oftentimes lower cost energy options, whether it's electric vehicles, heat pump water heaters, investing in weatherization to bring those costs down over time, are often folks who have the available upfront capital to do it or have access to loans to do it. And so the risk is that as we go forward, we have the energy economy becomes much more inequitable, and the folks who most need to see their energy cost burdens reduced, that 19% of household income going to pay for heating and electricity, may be stuck on fuels that and inefficient energy equipment that is already and will increasingly become unaffordable versus those who are able to get on those more stable and low cost price groups. That's what, from a perspective of caring about affordability for low and middle income Vermonters, we need to find a way to address as a council and the legislature and as a state. So I'll just leave it at that as a council and then go back to my EA Manhattan presentation, if that's okay. But there's tension there, right? Because then the question becomes, where do you get the investment to provide the grants and the incentives for the low and moderate income folks? And people don't want, and then on the other side, there are folks who don't want to see revenue raised to be able to do that, and you're leaving them exposed and stuck.
Yeah. May I say one more thing?
One more thing.
So I would just say, as a focus of places where we can do better, like connecting emissions reductions to that economic transformation is really, really important, because we are all aware that Vermont's emissions are very, very low in the grand scheme of things, and that reducing them, while, noble, it's not, that is not, what Vermonters who are worried about their wallets are worried about. And so I don't think we're doing a great job connecting emissions reduction to economic transition that is happening, even though they're connected, like the work that we're doing. So just as feedback for someone who does a lot of modeling for us, which is incredibly valuable, and, data production, which, I share with my Vermonters all the time. I just want to say thank you again to EAN for this data, which is really great. I can't remember which hat you have on, right?
I think I'm back to EAN.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just great to show that to Mike. Sorry.
So let's do a time check. Jared, we've kept you past your time, but we don't have to be anywhere till 3, but we need to give people a break. So where are you in your presentation? Have we bogged you down like?
We have a chair.
Okay, all
I think I
right.
have like 10 slides left.
Great, you don't have to rush. I just wanted to get a sense of like, let's try to, what do you think, 15 minutes and everybody gets half an hour before floor? Is that okay, everybody? Okay.
So that means no questions, Madam Chair?
No, that doesn't mean.
Just for you, members.
Just for me, okay.
No, that doesn't mean that. If we go, I'm not saying some hard thing about 2:30. I just want to be respectful of Jared, and I'm not in a rush. Other folks may want to take a break.
I am available as long as you will or want to have me.
Okay.
So, but I will try to be efficient. This is another way of looking at our emissions than as compared to this graph. And it shows the sector by sector change over time since 2005. And you can see that there's really differential progress by sector. We've actually achieved fairly large emissions reduction in the transportation sector. We're going to work on a report in March that looks at why this is happening. Initially, I think that there's 3 big reasons that I want to kind of test the hypothesis about. A big one is an increasing amount of telecommuting. So especially pre and post pandemic. So we've seen a reduction in vehicle miles traveled, which means reduced fuel use and reduced emissions as more people work from home and continue working from home compared to pre-pandemic. Another one is the increasing fuel efficiency of the fossil fleet, of the gas vehicle fleet. And then, of course, there's also an increasing amount of purchases of electric vehicles. So those three things, telecommuting, efficiency of the gas fleet, and electric vehicles, I think those are all factors that are contributing to this. To what degree? That's something we're going to dig into. But there is some real progress and success that is happening in the transportation sector.
Mm-hmm.
The greatest reductions have happened over here in the electricity sector. And I think it's fair to say that it's very much linked to policy choices that have required those portfolios to become lower emitting over time. You know, you can look, this was about the passage of the first renewable energy standard and then the emissions declining. These black dashed lines, this speaks to what Representative Kleppner was talking about. Those are reference points. So it's not a requirement that each sector fall below those lines, but if each sector was to reduce in line with the overall statewide requirements, that's where they would be below as of 2025. The electricity sector is already below it. It's the one sector that has already, if you were to think about it sector by sector, which isn't the right way to think about it, but they've already met the Global Solutions Act requirements. The challenges in these other sectors, especially the thermal sector, this is where fossil fuel use and emissions has been most durable and persistent, and in need of assistance to help people, as you would say, Representative Segura, get off of those high cost and price volatile fossil fuels, but also the fuels that happen to be incredibly polluting and leading to these high levels of climate pollution.
Yeah, quick question. On the waste management, is that the energy it takes to collect waste, or does that have anything to do with, for example, Coventry and the fact that we don't put compost in the trash anymore? Like,
Yeah.
what does that capture?
So the fuel related to like waste hauling, that would be captured in the transportation sector. The waste management, that's primarily referring to methane emissions from
landfills.
Yes.
And does that have anything to do with that change?
That's a really good question.
The compost law.
Yeah, I would want to defer to folks who have more expertise about that at the Department of Environmental Conservation and A&R, but that's a great question.
Interesting, maybe, yes.
So you touched on methane generation or methane gas release out of the landfill. So one utility I'm aware of has methane generation plants at the Coventry landfill. Is any of that taken into the energy production within the state?
Yeah, so if it's captured and then used as energy, then that would show up. Like, I know that there are, I don't know exactly about that example, but I know that there's like farm digesters that produce methane that go into the gas pipeline, and that would be counted as part of the gas mix in that energy mix.
Okay, so it is taken into consideration, those.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So this isn't different. This is just looking at it a different way. This was a multi-year going back to 2005. Over time, what's happening with the sectors? This is the latest snapshot from 2021. Where do Vermont's emissions come from? 39% transportation, 31% thermal, and then you can see the other sectors there. But 70% of this conversation, when it comes to climate pollution, or when it comes to energy costs, the vast bulk of it is in those two sectors: how we get around and how we heat our homes and buildings. This is the breakdown on the left of fuel use. So we say the thermal sector. That's a shorthand for what in the greenhouse gas inventory is called the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector. Those are interchangeable terms. One is easier to say. So I love to talk about the thermal sector, but it really means residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use. Residential sector is a little more than half of that fuel use. Commercial, a little more than a third. And industrial, this is as of 2021. And you can see the fuel mix changes, like more fossil gas used in the commercial sector than in residential. So we broke it down that way with state and federal data. On the right, you can kind of see how emissions break down light duty fleet versus heavy duty fleet. I think this is like, this is one of those human psychology things that is, it's a difficult balance, right? Because I've often talked with people about transportation emissions and say, well, how do we lower them? The big thing that we need to do is get those really big vehicles or those airplanes that are using lots of fuel to reduce. And that's a fair point, but there's a relatively small number of them. The much larger fuel use and the much larger amount of emissions comes from the 500,000 plus vehicles, all using smaller amounts of fuel, but it adds up to a much bigger amount, including 87% of our statewide transportation emissions from our light duty fleet, not our heavy duty fleet or our medium duty fleet.
Is natural gas or fossil gas such a big percentage of commercial industrial because RVT gas territory is up in Chittenden, Franklin? It's just a location.
I think that's likely in
location
some in
thing, right?
Addison. I think that's right in terms of a lot of the commercial and manufacturing space.
Okay.
Just to continue on the emissions theme, putting Vermont in context, I take your point, Representative Sevelia, that Vermont's overall emissions, total emissions, are lower than most other places around the world, most other surrounding states, because we have a lower population. If we're going to look at it on an even basis in terms of weighted for population per person, then I think it is fair to say that we have an outsized responsibility. Vermont's emissions per person are more than twice the global average, and they are the second highest per person in New England. Only New Hampshire produces more greenhouse gas pollution per person than Vermont. I wish that was not the case. My job isn't to say what's popular or convenient, but what is even what's true and inconvenient. And it's not just that Vermont has the second highest per person climate pollution produced in New England. It's also that of the New England states, unfortunately, we have made the least progress towards that first target that is in our Global Warming Solutions Act and that the United States committed to as part of the science-based targets in the Paris Climate Agreement. So if, to the extent that folks think it's important that not that we reduce emissions elsewhere, not that we solve the climate crisis, we clearly cannot do that. No state, no country can do that. But should we take responsibility for reducing our own emissions as we work to lower energy costs and move away from a less efficient, very inequitable energy system? If we are to have that metric of what is Vermont doing its part, then these per capita questions and this progress towards the commitment we've made in law are relevant metrics.
So I think I can demonstrate. Just really quick,
Oh, you
it's
can
right in front of us.
demonstrate
It's right in front of us.
your concept.
Okay.
Great. Demonstrate.
So I think what I'm seeing here is all of these states are reducing their per capita emissions more than Vermont. They have
So
much
their
higher-
total emissions.
Their
The
total
right is
emissions.
the total emissions.
Yeah. More than Vermont. And so Vermont is falling behind in emissions reduction. So I'm not sure how they're doing that. It could be EVs, it could be in their heating, it could be in their energy mix. But whatever it is that they're doing, they're changing the economy.
Yes.
They're changing how their economy works, and those are much larger states. And so what I see here, and I'm sorry, Jared, I'm gonna, it's like, it's not like we have to do our part to reduce emissions to, participate in climate change. I look at this and I say, oh boy, everyone else is getting in front of us and changing their economy, and we're falling behind, which means the people who get hurt when we fall behind economically, that's the work I do year round in rural Vermont. And that is what I worry about. So I see this and I say, we're falling behind in our economy, even though it says emissions.
And I do have some market and economy focused graphs coming up. This just zooms in on the electricity sector emissions. We've already covered this, so I don't want to go over too much more. I will say that for folks who want to dive into this and have an interactive dashboard, it's not just printed on the page. EAN hosts on our website interactive emissions dashboard and an energy tracking dashboard in terms of how much comprehensive home weatherization is happening around the state. How many cold climate heat pumps are being installed? How many heat pump water heaters? How many electric vehicles registered? You can break that down by county. You can break it down by town. You can look over time. Any way that you're curious about looking at that data for your district or for statewide policymaking, those are free and open resources that we maintain with a lot of help from getting data from Efficiency Vermont and other utilities and statewide partners. So just want to, these are screenshots from our emissions and energy dashboards that live on the Energy Action Network website that you're welcome to use and ask us questions about. So I think this gets to what part of what you're talking about, Vice Chair Sibilia. Part of what we're doing in tracking this energy transition is what are we seeing in terms of adoption in Vermont of these different technologies, and how does that break down by geography? So on the left here, you see 2016, the total amount of heat pump water heaters in homes was just over 5,000. As of 2023, it was nearly 20,000. So we're seeing this increase year after year after year of people adopting these more energy efficient, less polluting, oftentimes, not always, but very often, less expensive ways to heat water. You can see that there is differential rates of adoption by county on the right. What this blue piece shows is how much of the total target by 2030 that was in the pathways analysis for the climate action plan, in terms of how much adoption of on this measure, heat pump water heaters, we have to see by 2030. How far along are we? 14% as of 2030 towards the 2030 target. A lot more to do, both to reduce emissions and in many instances, not all, to reduce costs. And I do want to pause on that because the ability to achieve cost savings depends on a lot of things. It depends how you're, and this, let's take this example, how you're currently heating your water. And, if you're switching to a heat pump water heater, what are the rates in your utility? Might be a lot easier and less expensive to do in GMP territory than it might be in another. So there is nuance here. It varies. This is not just one simple story, but overall, there is significant opportunity that we're not fully taking advantage of to reduce costs and emissions. And this is part of it, the opportunity. This looks at comprehensive home weatherization, our 2030 target in the pathways versus where we stand now. We're nearly 40,000 homes comprehensively weatherized in Vermont, which is great. The challenge is that due to lots of reasons, funding, workforce, etc., that has tended to be fairly stable, about 2,000 homes a year weatherized, and it's been really difficult to move that number up, and there are still long wait lists in many territories for folks who want to get homes weatherized, as Vice Chair Campbell knows very well from his previous work. Again, this is from our dashboard. You can look at amounts of home weatherization total statewide over time, by county, by town. You do it for cold climate heat pumps. I mean, look at the rate of adoption that we're seeing, nearly 60,000 across the state as of 2023. And we're seeing a lot of it in Madison County, but less in the Northeast Kingdom. So just an informational resource that helps track this market transition in in a year with a year delay in terms of what we're seeing in terms of technology adoption.
This is such a rich presentation, Madam Chair. It'd be great to have more of it at some point.
Yeah.
And then lastly, just on the same point, we're doing the same thing for electric vehicles. This is a little out of date. As of July last year, we were at over 15,000 data from Drive Electric Vermont and the Department of Motor Vehicles. But you can see, this trajectory definitely increasing. As Representative Kleppner said earlier, a small percentage of the fleet still, and we've got over 550,000 vehicles in Vermont, in comparison to what the Climate Action Plan Pathways analysis points to. And I just had some examples on the potential economics of this. We looked at average, based on average miles traveled, average gasoline car comparable electric vehicle, lifetime potential savings on fuel and maintenance for an EV driven in Vermont, $9,500 over the lifetime compared to a gas vehicle. In terms of being able to access that, of course, the incentives matter to bring that upfront cost down. which is a big challenge right now because we don't know the future of the federal incentives. The state incentives have been spent out and have gone. And so there's a possibility that going forward, we'll just see the utility incentives. That will be a big question in terms of where those goes and what happens in terms of the ability for this to keep increasing.
Madam Chair, thank you. So does that number take into account replacement of the batteries over the lifetime of an EV? We know that they don't have an infinite lifespan.
Right.
And it is quite costly to change them. So does that number reflect that?
Yeah, that's the average lifetime cost of the maintenance of the EV. Now, if it goes beyond that, it's beyond, then the analysis would be different, but it's a similar thing on gasoline vehicles in terms of things that need to be changed out at different time periods. The maintenance costs and the repair costs are different, but it is doing an apples to apples comparison on that.
Rep. Morrow and
So that brings up an interesting question of how we factor in the changing technology. So for instance, the batteries on these cars are changing very rapidly. Cold climate heat pumps are getting much better and more efficient as we move forward, et cetera, et cetera. The hot water tanks, heat pump hot water tanks are getting better and better. So like when you're projecting out into the future, is efficiency, how do you factor in that, if at all?
Yeah. It's a great question because whenever we do modeling into the future at EAN, we're really hesitant to go beyond another 5 years, like go beyond 2030, because these markets and variables are changing so fast. And so, for instance, there's been analysis that's been produced for the Climate Council or for other bodies, that projects out to 2050. I have a much higher level of uncertainty about what the costs of those pieces of equipment will be 10 or 20 years from now than I do this year or next year or the year after, and what the efficiency will be. I think it's a really important point. But right now, a lot of the analysis is assuming current costs and current efficiencies. But we know as markets mature and you achieve economies of scale, usually you see a per unit cost reduction and improvements in efficiency. And those variables should be taken into account for different scenarios as we do modeling. My kind of mantra when it comes to modeling is take projections that are far off into the future with a large grain or many grains of salt, and that it's much easier to have confidence in the nearer term projections, and always ask questions about the assumptions behind long range projections.
Quick comment, I will say, in the business I ran, starting with the pandemic, I stopped doing forecasts out beyond 3 years.
Yeah.
Just because it felt the technology and the economy and the climate were all changing so fast that beyond that, it was too speculative. To Representative Southworth's question, the tech on my electric car told me when I was asking him about its long-term prospects, he said, these cars are great. Like, your engine's not going to give out on you. He said, it's not going to be the engine or the battery. It's going to be what eats every Vermont car. It's going to be rust on the roads that rust out your body so that you can't pass inspection. He said, that's what's going to kill your car. I said, that's another problem.
That's not our committee, right?
Yeah.
Salt committee.
Not the salt committee, but we can add it.
And I think this is my last slide, just an example on the water heater set. And this we're kind of ending with a major theme that we've talked about throughout, right? And this is the challenge of it's possible to get on lower cost curves to save money over time, but there's the hurdle of the upfront investment. So this is an example. Say your water heater dies, and your choice is whether to buy a new propane water heater or buy a heat pump water heater. Without incentives, oftentimes the cost of the equipment of the propane water heater is going to be lower. But over time, the higher cost of propane as a fuel, as opposed to efficiently using electricity, is going to bring this to $9,500 in lifetime cost for a propane water heater versus $6,500 in lifetime cost for a heat pump water heater, which can be even lower if with incentives. but there's just this distinction, like, and part of it is because less expensive equipment is often less expensive because it's more inefficient. I've had experiences where I get things in the mail from propane companies that say, we want to give you a free propane water heater if you sign up with us. Why are they doing that? They want to lock you in on their very high cost fuel. It's like the cell phone economics, right? You get a free cell phone, but you've got a really high monthly plan. And so I think part of what we need to do in Vermont is have a cost savings affordability conversation that is the whole picture, right? It's not just what is the upfront cost, but what is the lifetime costs and what are the potential savings month to month and year to year? Because when we only focus on the upfront cost, then it locks in higher cost and greater inefficiency over time. And with that, I just have some websites. I do
I think
my
we have
email address.
one final question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On that, if you could back up the one slide there, the $6,500 cost includes the monthly electric bill.
Yeah.
And how much do those average run on those?
I would have to go back and look. I don't recall off the top of my head.
Okay, and does that include if the homeowner has to upgrade his electric service from 100 amp to 200 amp?
That's not represented here. That would have to go into the installed costs. So that's a good point. In that scenario, the installation cost would go up, and that's not reflected here. This is just the equipment.
Yeah.
And are these referring to storage hot water heaters, on-demand hot water heaters? And have you looked at the on-demand portion, the propane on-demand, the electric on-demand, to see if there's a comparison there that works out differently?
Yeah, we could, this comparison is just a standard heat pump water heater with a propane water heater. Yeah, we could look at that. I think it is an important point. This is not represented in an electric on-demand water heater where the cost would be higher. That would be the kind of more resistance-based technology rather than but yes, that's a good question. I will run back and we'll look at.
Greg Morrow?
So a lot of these questions come down to capital. You're talking about upfront costs. So I just went through this process to migrate from a fuel oil hot water heater to a heat pump hot water heater, and through the moderate income program, and it was extremely efficient and easy, except I had to have the money up front.
Yeah.
So this is an energy committee, but really we need some economists to come in and there's got to be some models around the country of how we deal with the money, because everything flows from that.
Yeah. And that was the purpose of the Affordable Heat Act.
Yeah, Representative Southworth.
No.
Sorry,
Yeah.
by all means.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So what about how are we going to how the utility is going to deal with this increased load, which is going to be an issue?
Yeah. I
was going to say quick answer, and then I do want to wrap up and to reassure you that we will be having utilities in and Belco and ISO New England and all of that.
Okay.
So, but
excellent question.
that is a great question.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
No, I know we're over time, so I do have some slides on it. I think that you're exactly right, that it would be great to hear. I would respectfully encourage testimony from Belco. They've done a lot of modeling on the long-range transmission plan, and yeah, it's very good.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for coming. It sounds like we need to have you come back.
Please don't, any way that I can be a resource, either in testimony or providing information or resources, or if you have suggestions on additional data tracking research or analysis we can do that would be helpful to the state, please don't ever hesitate to